Welcome to Up Close. My name is Donald Jones. I'm professor of law at the University of Miami, and this is a show, an electronic magazine about politics, law, and justice, where we address issues ranging from equal justice in U.S. courts to human rights issues in Africa and the Caribbean. Today, I have a special treat. I'm here with Willard Shepard, Esquire, a distinguished lawyer, and in the recent past, an Emmy-winning journalist. And so, Willard, say hello to our audience.
Okay, it's always great to be with you and learn from you with your constitutional law expertise and those things. And, we're flipping the script here because normally I'm the one interviewing you.
Yes.
And now today, you and I are going to have this conversation. I'm delighted to be on your program.
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor. And today we're going to talk about the topic of how far have we come? And when George Floyd was tragically and unjustifiably killed in state-sponsored violence, his tragic death opened a window of opportunity for us as a society to consider the issue of race and the criminal justice system. How can we prevent issues like this from recurring again? And we want to make an assessment, first of all, of how far have we come, and we want to talk about some of the cases that have arisen which show how far we still have to go. Willard, you have been a sophisticated observer of the American scene for many years. And as a lawyer, you've addressed issues of race and criminal justice system. What is your view at this time in terms of how far we've come as a society in addressing the issue of racism and the criminal justice system?
Well, first of all, I kind of look at this through three lenses that I've been fortunate enough and blessed enough to be able to look that way at this. The first is on the military front, is, from my time as a fighter pilot in the military, and looking at things through an organizational perspective as to a government entity and how we've addressed these matters. Secondly, having the great fortune of NBC sending me to law school at FIU, which has the highest bar passage rate in the state. Sorry about that, professor, at the University of Miami, and has had it for a decade. To being a bar member here in the state of Florida. From that perspective, to see how, and all the challenges that we still really face in these areas to provide equal justice. And the third thing, as a journalist for NBC for 3 decades, being in the environments of these people, of the cases of when they feel that their family members have been victimized.
You're on the front line.
Yes, and people who've lost their loved ones. And during the George Floyd tragedy, and shortly thereafter, actually out with NBC and Telemundo and our teams in the streets, walking and marching along with the people who were there that were using their First Amendment rights to be able to go out and voice what they thought was about this injustice and conveying that to the public. So I look at it in 3 different realms.
Right.
But when we go back several years and say, hey, this is where, and many in our community say that there was this injustice just across the board, that George Floyd was a tragic example of what happens all the time in the justice system to minorities, people who have immigrated to this country and may speak a different language. Fortunately, not to the degree of someone losing their life, but if you look at the rates, and you're
so it's
an expert
emblematic
in this,
of a bigger problem.
Yes, of course. I mean, if you look at the rates of incarceration amongst African Americans, amongst people of Latin descent, when people look, regardless of any type of race, of an education. The more education you have, the less chances are you're going to end up incarcerated. So across those panels.
So there's an intersection, intersection of race, the intersection of class, intersection of national origin.
Correct.
And the problem is systemic.
Across the board. As today, if we went to any of our penal facilities, whether
Yes.
they be here in Miami-Dade County, Broward County, South Florida, across the state of Florida. You looked at the Florida correctional facilities, and if you looked at our federal correctional facilities here in South Florida, Coleman Correctional Facility in Central Florida, those numbers would simply bear out that
You don't even have to be a statistician.
Yes.
Just look at the faces,
Yes.
the color of the faces, and the
Correct.
orange jumpsuits.
Correct.
It tells a story.
Yes,
A
and you
story of-
ask, okay, well, wait a second. What do all these people have in common? And then who's missing?
Yes.
And by and large, the people that are missing are people that fortunately have gotten a lot of education, or people that are not of a minority group are missing in that demographic. And you say, well, wait a second, how is that possible? Why is these numbers
That's a
overwhelming?
fascinating problem. And one of the things, I wrote a book called Dangerous Spaces, America Beyond the Racial Profile. And one of the things I found is that the way that we police communities is different. So, for example, in New York during stop and frisk, they found that whites were twice as likely to possess illegal guns as blacks. But the black neighborhoods were much more likely to be the targets of massive policing. They policed military style with military style campaigns targeted on what we would call inner city areas. And so there's this image that the black community is a war zone, that the black community is the source of so many problems, when in fact that's a stereotype in many instances in which, in this context, there were more guns in the white community, but the policing, the over-policing, took place in black communities.
And I want to, when I say go inside baseball, and you
Yes.
know this, but I think many times there's a stereotype
Yes.
that people in our minority communities, that they are either associated with crime,
Yes.
or it's okay with them in some
Right,
manners.
right.
You know, I grew up in a inner city neighborhood, and even though my parents had a tremendous amount of education,
Yes.
we were victims of burglaries and all different types of things.
Right.
And the people that, the real victims of crime on the gigantic level are people that live in minority communities. You know, they're the ones who are associated with crime, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. But what are they lacking? They don't have the resources to say, you know what? I'm going to move out of this neighborhood.
Right.
I'm just going to pick up, elevate, and move out of this neighborhood.
They're marooned by socioeconomic.
So they don't have an option. They don't have a choice. And also, as I always make a kind of an example to, you know, when you're talking about a mobster mentality, there are people in these neighborhoods who some rule and they use fear. And it's a threat to your life to actually cooperate with the police and associate with the police.
What you're talking about is how culture is in the mix. And there was a great book in which the author talks about street code and street culture, and this whole idea that in the inner city, in many inner city areas, they valorize and they fight for respect, and they valorize the person who can make the most money, regardless of how they've made it, and so this is what I call a cultural pathology. So Du Bois wrote that the problem that black people have are not merely, first of all, they face the problem of systemic racism, but in addition to that, sometimes you internalize those conditions, and by internalize it and through lack of self-esteem, many people act out behaviors and pathologies that compound the problem.
And also, when it comes to the law enforcement side of this, law enforcement officers that go in those environments, everyone wants to go home at the end of the day.
Right.
Okay. But when you think about, despite all of the training that our law enforcement officers, especially here in departments in South Florida, have done an incredible job with diversity training, with trying and doing their best to incorporate people, to set aside any biases that they may have along those lines. But despite all that training, people are human.
Yes.
And regardless of race or color, creed, religion, any of those types of things, going into an dangerous environment is something that any individual will say that and will feel that they do want to protect themselves. And therefore, when you talked about the types of things that and strategies and tactics, and sometimes military-style tactics used by law enforcement officers, those are used, in essence, to try to keep everybody safe across the board.
I understand you perfectly.
Yes.
And so one thing I try to avoid is demonizing anyone. No one should be demonized, and we shouldn't demonize the police. But at the same time, we have to recognize there is a problem of systemic racism. Let's not duck that. Let's recognize we have a systemic problem that we have to address. And I think what you're saying is, in fact, that since George Floyd, we've invested a great deal in training. We've invested a great deal in trying to figure out. California has passed laws, and other states have been leaders in passing laws that limit the times when police can use force, and we've struggled to try to find ways to minimize violence, but yet we still see systemic disparities. Just to give you an example, we have a law that says the police no longer in the state of Florida have to arrest because of possession of marijuana. So although they're not required to arrest, nonetheless, the arrests are still being made. And what we find is that blacks are 4 to 5 times as likely in 2023 to be arrested for marijuana when blacks and whites use marijuana at statistically similar rates. You look at the statistics on deadly force. Far fewer people have been killed in 2023 than in other years, but there's still the disproportion. And we still see a disproportion. And even now, even today, a black person born today, a black male, has 1 in 5 chances of going to prison by the time they're 35. That's better than before. Right. But we're still not out of the woods. We still have this problem of systemic discrimination. So we can't say that all police are bad. I think most are not. But the systemic problem is there. One of the things we want to think about is, why is it still there? And
when you talked about that, and I think 99.9% of police officers do want to do the right thing, are doing the right thing. It's just like anything else, whether you're lawyers, pilots, professors, journalists. There are, unfortunately, a couple people in every profession, teachers, whatever it is, that are up to no good. And we need to hold those people accountable and make sure that their types of behavior doesn't bleed over into the gigantic amount of people who are doing the right thing.
Well, I agree with that. I think one way to get at the problem is, instead of focusing, and one thing that I think has been done is massive amounts of training, but we still see huge problems in terms of cases which come up over and over again in which violence is being used, and it seems so tragically unnecessary. And let me shift to talk about a real case and provide a context for us to discuss. I think the woman's name is Sonia Massie.
Yes, in the Midwest.
And so this is a woman who clearly was mentally challenged, had some mental deficits, and the police come to her house because she's called them and she's seeking protection from the police, as all citizens have a right to do. And she thinks there's a prowler outside, and the police check and they find that, well, there isn't a prowler, but they do see a car parked in the driveway which doesn't seem to belong to the house, so they want to question her. They want to find out, ask for ID, and they go into the house. So all this is, I think, fairly normal, fairly unobjectionable, by the book. And there's a pot. Now, I don't know the facts, but as I understand them, as I report to me, there was a pot boiling on the stove.
On the stove.
And the police were concerned, which they certainly have a right to be. And so what I think should have happened is they should have asked, well, you mind if I take the pot off the stove? We feel more comfortable. Or they could have left the house. So many different options. But what happens is that the woman apparently goes over to the stove and picks up the pot. Still no problem. But then she advances toward them with the pot in her hand. And then, according to what we see in the camera, they ask her, tell her to stop, and she says something that suggests hostility. And instead of speaking in a calm voice, instead of retreating, the police move forward and draw their guns. And it's not inevitable, but what the predictable happens, because they, instead of retreating, they went forward, they drew their guns, and we end up with what I would think of, and what most people I think of, was a tragically unnecessary death. The prosecution in this case called it murder. What do you think, Attorney Shepard?
Well, I think, first of all, obviously our condolences. We see this too often.
Yes.
And this is something that law enforcement, our communities across the board, all need to do to try to prevent exactly this type of situation. I will say, and I'm an evidence-based person.
Yes.
The one thing that we've seen, not just with this particular case, but you talked about George Floyd and other cases. I can't tell you how important that it has been, the implementation of body cameras at police departments here in Florida and across the country, so that, just imagine, rewind when you first started practicing law.
Yes.
Which was way before I started practicing law.
Yes.
This exact scenario and no camera, what would you think would have transpired?
Well, then I think that based on the way things worked traditionally, the police would have said, well, I was in fear of my life. There's no witness, she's dead. To contradict them, you have two officers both telling the same story, and the story would be told in such a way that would fit what I would call the Garner model, Tennessee versus Garner model, and the police would be, it would be written up, the police would be exonerated, and it would have been business as usual. But because we could see in the camera them advancing toward her, we could see them drawing their guns, we could see that the woman was mentally ill, it raises serious questions. And so so yes.
You mentioned George Floyd as well.
Yeah.
And you have a laundry list of other cases on here that, we could talk about.
If we do no more than talk about this one, we do good, something good.
They all have pretty much the same thing in common with each other. And therefore, that's why I wanted to mention the cameras first, and your thought and viewpoint when we talked about how far we've come since George Floyd.
Yes.
Think about how far we've come, as you addressed when you first started practicing law. When you're dealing with these cases and a violation of a person's civil rights, hopefully they're still alive to talk about it. But when they're deceased and their loved ones are devastated, prior to these cameras coming into effect and being able to provide a real world view, not a complete conclusive view of what happened, but a gigantic amount of information. And that's where I think the biggest leap forward has come in providing justice for a person like Miss Massie and her family. And
well,
I would say,
it's a good first step, but it's a step of a 1,000-mile journey, and I think we've got so many miles to go. Let me give you my understanding of some of the problems here, and let me try to create a context for us. In 1985, the Supreme Court decided an important case. It was a case of Tennessee versus Garner. And in that case, which arises in Memphis, Tennessee, the police respond to a call. It's a call about a prowler inside. And they come to the event, and they have probable cause to believe a burglary is taking place. And a neighbor tells them, look, there's a burglar inside the house next to me. And as soon as they get there, there's a figure that runs from the house. The door slams. They run from the house. They have probable cause to believe that a burglary is taking place, and it's in the nighttime, so that makes it a felony. And they see this figure running across the yard, and before he can climb the fence, the policeman admits, yes, I shined a flashlight, I saw it was a youth, and I saw that he had nothing in his hand. So there was no question he was unarmed. And he yells, halt. And the young man doesn't halt. I think his name is Harmon. And when he climbs the fence, the police fires and kills the youth, even though he's unarmed. And when he does that, he acts pursuant to the policy which says you can shoot a fleeing felon. So they took a categorical approach in Memphis. They said if it's a fleeing felon, you automatically have a right to shoot and to use deadly force. And what the Supreme Court says in that case, it says, well, look, it is not better that all felons be killed rather than escape. We have to distinguish. If the felon is unarmed and they don't present a significant threat of danger to you or a third person immediately, then you can't shoot. But of course, it leaves open a wide area of discretion. And the standard that's...
And Professor, just for our audience, that elaborate on just some of the crimes that the court indicated could be used, where force can be used, and by their definition would allow to be used, because this case that you're talking about is actually the one that dictates policy here in our South Florida police departments and beyond about when a pursuit can take place. When a chase, the chases that we see on our news programs at times. Harris. When are these types of things allowed? When are they not allowed? And when can deadly force be used?
See, that's an interesting question. The standard of Supreme, when a person shoots, when a police officer shoots, that's called a seizure. Under the Fourth Amendment, that represents an event called a seizure. When a seizure takes place, the Fourth Amendment becomes operative. And the standard under the Fourth Amendment is objective reasonableness. That means the police officer has to act in a way that is objectively reasonable. And what the court does in Garner say it's only objectively reasonable in the context of a flight of a felon if there is some evidence, some reasonable ground to believe that person is armed and dangerous, or now that's the starting point. It could also be true if the felon had committed a felony which involved deadly force,
or a reasonable belief that another felony is about to be committed.
Absolutely. So, but either way, there's a notion of necessity. Notion of necessity. Now, what's interesting is that while the court says that in that case, this was a case about a fleeing felon, there are other cases in which the court, another case called Scott versus Harris, where there's a vehicle chase. Now, in that case, the court says, well, Garner doesn't apply here, and in this case, we only apply a standard of reasonableness. So what the court does in Garner is it gives us a standard, but generally the standard for the use of deadly force is reasonableness. And many states have taken different positions. Some states have taken the position it has to be a felony in which was deadly. Others that it has to be a felony involving some kind of force. And so there's a wide variation. So what Garner does, it starts us off down a path, but it doesn't define how far that path goes, and it leaves it to states to decide. And one other thing that happens is that there's a rule that many states follow, because there's an idea that the police make split-second decisions. And so there's a rule in many circuits that the police, because they make a split-second decision, you can only evaluate them on what they did at that moment of decision, when they're facing the uplifted knife, or they're facing, in this case,
a pot of
boiling water. And so that favors the police. And I think that, so there's this tension here between two things. If you look at the case of Sonia Massie, we must ask the question, did the police create the conditions of their own defense? So if a car is rolling down the street at speed, And can the police simply jump in front of the car and now say, aha, my life is in danger, and draw their gun? I would hope not, because you should not be able to create the conditions of their own defense. Would you say, yes or no, that when the police officers advanced towards Sonia Massie, and we don't know the facts, but let's assume that's true, that once they drew down on her and advanced on her, that they, in effect, were like the policeman who jumps in front of a car? Could they not simply have retreated? Could they not simply have safely retreated and allowed her to live and not drawn their guns and not created the confrontation? Did they have that option? And does that, in your view, matter?
Well, it matters 1,000%. But my question in a factual part of this to the evidence, and I don't know the answer to this question,
right?
But did they have a taser where there was some, I'm going to say, middle ground to disable an individual?
Right.
You know, the officers all here in Florida have tasers to be able to use that, and that in that type of scenario, a reasonable decision could be the use of a taser to be able to disable the individual without using deadly force, you know, from this.
Well, see, this is where I think interpretation comes in. What some police officers would say is that once I'm faced with a deadly threat, I should be able to use deadly force, and that's sort of what I call the broad, reasonable standard. Now, there's a narrower standard, which we could also argue, is that, well, no, you should only be able to use deadly force when you have when it's the least restrictive alternative. And in that case, that's the rule you're applying. Wasn't there this least restrictive alternative? I would argue for the least restrictive alternative, because we should place a high value in our society for human life.
1,000%. And in this particular case, and this will ultimately come out, and because of the type of danger that they believe that she presented to them, you mentioned retreating.
Yes.
So in this particular case, since she didn't have a firearm, okay, and she didn't have a knife, and from a pure physical point of view, from the body camera I saw, she was not a woman that was physically going to be able to overpower these two officers. That leaving and taking themselves away from the situation was certainly an option. Let's put it like that. I think I can confidently say exiting from the property was an option. And that was something that could have been done. And I think that ultimately will be the linchpin here as to whether or not they, A, followed policy, B, met a standard, a reasonable standard of where they felt in danger of their lives or great bodily harm, because they had an option to exit the situation and would be able to do that where they would not really be in danger.
And so what you're saying, and I love your answer, is what they should have done. But you see, sometimes there's a debate. And one debate is between what do we call necessity? So some people say, well, necessity simply means, in this case, it has to be reasonable, because that's all the Fourth Amendment says. Now, other people say, well, regardless of what the Fourth Amendment literally says, we in this country have a high value in human life. So as we would interpret that necessity, it should not only be whether it's reasonable, but whether in that actual, and reasonable in the abstract, but what people would say is that it should, in the actual, given the actual facts, was actually necessary, or was it the least restrictive alternative? And that's where there's often a debate. And I think that's where the split second rule comes in. What many courts do is they say, we don't ask what happened before that split second. We simply ask at the split second that they have to decide. So if she has a pot in her hand and they think that within another second or half a second they're going to get shot, then they're going to instruct the jury what happened within that split second. Whereas what I would hope the court would do would be to not simply ask what happened that split second, but ask, did they create the conditions of their own defense? That were they like the person who runs in front of a moving car and then draws their gun? Could they not have retreated? And if they could have had that option, then I would say that represents an unjustifiable killing.
So I think it all has to be, when I say in context, and not just that split second. Let's say that Miss Massie, instead of being an adult female, was a 6 or 7 year old child that was giving his mom problems, and she called the police, and he ran or she ran and picked up some boiling water and came toward the police.
And what's the distance? Was it 5 feet? Was it 10 feet? Was it 20 feet? Could I safely have gotten out of this? And so,
and if you and I were associated with this case, we would.
She would still be alive.
We would have an expert, a physics expert, that would come along and talk about a woman of her size and stature and physical condition, the amount of velocity that she would be able to accelerate the water from the pot. Well, and the distance. Yes, I put my physics hat on.
But of course, that's if they don't apply.
Were they within? Was the officer, once we would ultimately determine how far that water could have traveled?
But this illustrates the mischief
within that.
This illustrates the mischief of the split-second rule. If you apply the split-second rule, you simply ask, at the split-second, the officer had to make that decision. Was he in imminent danger of serious bodily harm? Whereas if we don't apply that rule, or we don't apply it mechanically, we should be able to go back before that split second. So much depends on how the court sees how much leeway. But let me ask a very different question, and that's the whole question of the split second rule. Why do these problems still happen? Why, 4 years after George Floyd, are we still seeing cases like this? Are we still seeing cases in which people are being killed under circumstances which seem so terribly unnecessary? There was a case in Memphis. There was a case in the Midwest. There was a case of an airman who they go to the door. He's holding a gun. His name is Fort.
Which he has a right to do in the state of Florida.
Right. And he's holding a gun, but the gun is pointed down, not at the police officer. And within 2 seconds of the police officer getting there, he's shot dead. Why do we keep seeing cases like this? Is it because of lack of training? Is it because of a police culture? Is it simply white supremacy? Why do you see these cases continuing to happen?
I think just, unfortunately, when you talk about policing and these kinds of interactions, that is something where we have, I'm going to use the word, this conflict, that until we're able to, on a societal level, remove this type of conflict, where you have people that, for economic reasons and educational reasons and all those types of things that we talked about, until those things come to the forefront, we're going to always have some of these situations, but the numbers would be reduced, because you're going to have a person like Miss Massie. If she truly needed that type of mental health and assistance, she wouldn't have been at home alone. She would have had a caregiver with her. She would have had a professional with her. Or she might not have been living at home at that time, because she would have gotten the care for her mental health issue that she needed, and had been in professional care at a location, at a facility. And so I think the vast majority of these tragedies, that's, as you know, with most things, when there's an accident, it's not that one instant that happened. It's a lineup in the flying business. When there's something that goes awry, there were a whole series of things prior to that.
You're talking about,
generally.
Yes, you're talking about the fact that things are causally overdetermined. That there's more than one cause. And so what you're saying is that there's a social context in which these things are occurring. And let me give you some understanding. when police neighborhoods like Coral Gables, Beverly Hills, I think you'll find very few cases where the police arrest someone for marijuana where the person is shot. Very few, and I would guess none.
Correct.
There are very few instances in which a police arrest someone for jaywalking and that person ends up with their neck broken. And so, but we do see these cases increasingly and an increasing disparity in cases where people are black and poor. And I think there's several pieces to that. One piece is that there is an image that people have of certain communities. We see that in cases like Boys in the Hood and many other films like this, where the black community is a source of crime. You go into the black community, you park your car, within 5 minutes, your car is taken apart or you're carjacked. And so there's an image of the black community as a place of savagery, a place of where a community of criminals. And so that's one image that is in mind. There's another piece too, though, and that is historically, communities where there's a great deal of poverty are communities where there are high levels of violence and carjackings and so forth. So there is this dimension of this slender thread of truth that yes, there's more violence historically in black communities and that are poor. And so this is a template. So when an officer goes into the house of someone, then they may be more afraid. In addition to that, you have the fact that I think historically blacks have been associated with crime. We often say in my class, race defines crime and crime defines race. And so we tend to think, when we say the word crime, now say black crime. Let's say the word people. Now say black people. You'll feel a difference, and that's the culture that we are situated in. A culture in which there are stereotypes not only of people but of whole communities, and I think that plays a role. And I think one role it plays is what we call cognitive bias. So if you see a person who's white walking down the street in a hoodie, I think that if Zimmerman, that person would have probably made it home. But you see Trayvon Martin in a hoodie. And saggy pants. Well, I don't really have saggy pants, but if you do see that, then that person may not make it home.
And the numbers clearly show that.
Right.
And the question in terms of how do we overcome that?
Yeah.
As I mentioned, all of these societal things that on the educational, economic, medical, psychological front that can be done to reduce the number of conflict circumstances between law enforcement and the members of our minority community. But when they do occur, to make sure that the law enforcement officers have executed and had all the training to make sure that they make a proper decision. Because 90% of the time, they're the ones who have the life in their hands.
Let me give you an example of something that would help, I think. For example, suppose there was a registry, and that registry was within the police database. So they know that whatever home they go to, this person may have a mental health issue, or this person may have a felony for whatever. And so if you had this kind of registry, the police could have some way of knowing something about the context of the person that they're seeing, then that might have helped. Another thing that I think would help is if police did have specific training about the problem of people who are mentally disordered. So, for example, when they went to the house, it's my understanding the house was disheveled. That was a clue.
Yep.
About this person, and it should be a protocol that you follow in situations like that. You should consider whether you need to be in the house, and you should consider how you talk to the person. Do you want to yell, or you want to try to use? So there are many different factors that can plug into this.
If you remember, right after George Floyd, and many people were critical, saying, "Oh, those people want to defund the police."
Right.
You know, the defund the police was not. Don't give law enforcement money.
Right.
If this community where Miss Massie lived had been funded along some of the suggestions that were made, the police wouldn't even been in her house. They might have sat out in front, And the mental health professional would have gone in and said, "Hey, Miss Massie, what's going on today? Are you upset?" And the police there for security, outside the property, and maybe standing at the door, but they would have had a professional that was there, and this collision would have, chances are, would have never happened.
Right. Another piece is that there's certain situations which may not require a policeman to come to the house armed. So, for example, if it's a prowler outside call, you could have investigated that without the police necessarily either having to get out of the car or having to draw their guns or have to knock on a person's door. And so there are ways in which, through legislation, we can reduce the contact. One way, for example, just generally is reduce the instances when police stop a car just for, let's say, a broken taillight. Do we need to stop cars every time there's a broken taillight? Or we could use cameras and say, go get your car fixed. Do we need to have laws that say a person can be arrested for marijuana? Should that be a non-arrestable offense? And so I think that the first point that I would look at even before training is how can we create a legal system, a legal regime in which we reduce the instances in which police are having to confront. Whenever I confront the police, what I want to do is I want to put my hands out. I want to make sure that I'm not going to be another statistic. And so what we want to do is reduce the instances in which I'm put in that situation, you see. And so I think we need to think of legislative ways that we can reduce the number of crimes, reduce the kind of situations where we have these conflicts. And another piece, too, simply has to do with the amount of investment we're willing to make in communities, not just to mental health, but to other services and so forth, so that the more that we invest in communities, the more there's going to be conflict, the less crime is going to take place.
We just ran into, before you and I started our program here at the Community News Network, one of the candidates for mayor of Miami-Dade County.
Okay.
And if you looked, and not saying that this candidate had any of this idea, but when you talk about taxpayer dollars, if the taxpayer dollars were invested in the correct educational programs, and job training programs, that would be a much wiser investment of money than incarcerating people at the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Facility.
Right.
It cost us as taxpayers more money per person to do that than if we would have a decade before that and it saw an issue, given the proper education, given the proper job skills, those types of things, we wouldn't be spending the money every day.
So one way to understand systemic racism is to understand how racism is interlocking, or how social conditions that result from racism interlock. So, for example, if we invested in housing, if we invested in creating jobs program, if we invested in schools in inner cities, and many of the schools in Miami that were segregated in the 1950s are still segregated, could we invest in those schools to bring up the quality of education? There's a relationship between unemployment and crime. If we can reduce the level of employment, there will be less crime, there will be less violence. And so they're interlocking problems, the problem of poor housing, the problem of disparities in education, and all these problems are linked to the violence and the problems that you see in these communities. We can change that. We change the image of those communities. We change, arguably, ultimately, the relationship those communities have with the police, because those people are more empowered. If you have a person who's a taxpayer, he has more power than a person who isn't. A person has a job, has more dignity. So there are ways that we can address what I think are at the foundation, at the root of why these things are, but we can't address these problems unless we're willing to deal with the roots of the problem. The original meaning of radical is to deal with the roots. And so what I would say is that while we've made much progress since George Floyd, we haven't addressed the roots, which are socioeconomic and which require massive investment in these communities, much more than we're doing. Training is good, but that's an incremental step. The big step is to try to change the socioeconomic conditions which are feeding into this. But let me let I'm interviewing you. So.
Well, I'll just say finally as we wrap up that we're going into what will be a heated political season here.
Yes.
And that hopefully the next time you invite me back,
yes,
we can address what are specifically these types of things across the board that deal with an educational system, a healthcare system, a system for economic opportunities that puts people in a position of whereby they are not in a position of where they feel like, hey, I need to commit a crime so that I can stay in my apartment. Right. And that on a larger level, as I always say, an investment but it's got to be a forward-thinking person.
Forward-thinking leadership.
Yes, that says, you know what? We are going to actually do some investment in the future. And I'll make an analogy for you. There's nowhere you can drive in South Florida and not come across a road construction project that's underway somewhere. Right. And those generally are not new roadways being built. They're maintenance on the infrastructure of the roadway to keep it in good condition. Just imagine if we did the same thing with our roadways with what we do with a significant part of our population. And that is, they don't get any infrastructure maintenance. They don't get any new asphalt. They don't get any new concrete. Understood. They don't get any new supports. Understood. Okay? Ultimately, if we drove down that roadway and we just drove on it and drove on it and drove on it, ultimately, the roadway is going to start to fail. Potholes. Structural failures, all different types of things until hopefully there's not some serious tragedy, but there's a serious tragedy or it's so bad, the residents of that area start complaining. They start calling the county commission and they start calling their state representative. Hey man, my roadway's messed up. You people don't know what you're doing. Why would you do this? I'm gonna vote for somebody else. And something gets done about it. So that analogy is we let this segment of our population simply not get any infrastructure improvements all along the way. And then when they collapse a building, i.e. or collapse a roadway, and now we got a crime. Now, okay, whoa, wait a second. We got to do something with this. And it cost us so much more money. And the gigantic difference is, I was making an analogy with an object. The gigantic difference is we're talking about a person that could have had a productive life and been productive, have some skill set to add to our society, but that doesn't happen.
And that person now is lost to us. Ask not for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for all of us. But I think what you're saying, it's a metaphor for social isolation. The lack of infrastructure is the extent to which certain communities are disconnected and people don't feel fully empowered or even fully human. But I think another piece that I don't want to neglect, and I want to suggest that it's not just a question of training, it's a question of how much you want to invest in these communities, is the whole issue of over-policing. I think the more people are stopped by the police unnecessarily, the more people who are made to be patted down, the more people who are arrested for arbitrary crimes. There are people in woman in Fort Lauderdale who was arrested for riding a bicycle without a registration. That's a symptom of over-policing. And so until we're willing to address the policy, not just training, but the policies that we use and how the police are deployed. What crimes are people being arrested for? Should anyone be arrested for marijuana? That costs money. Instead of investing in arresting people for marijuana, let's invest in education. Instead of arresting people for riding a bicycle without a registration, let's invest in housing. And so I think we need to make structural changes and how we see these communities and how we see these people. We have to value these communities instead of devalue them with over-policing. And and ultimately we have to do this. We have to create hope. There's some people who are living in communities where they don't have hope for another job. They don't have hope. They've gone to schools which have underserved them. They don't have hope to be able to get out of their job as a dishwasher, or they give up and they become substance abusers. We have to increase hope to decrease violence and crime. But I just want to say that it's an honor for me. And many times I've been on television. I've been interviewed by distinguished journalists such as yourself. And it's an honor for me to finally have a chance to have you as a guest and you as our talent and expert.
Okay, well, it was awesome. I appreciate you having me.
You honor me.
You know, we are going to continue, and thank you. I look forward to come back and doing it again with you soon.
You're a great man, and thank you for honoring me with your wisdom and knowledge. You've been listening to Up Close. I'm Donald Jones, professor of law at the University of Miami. And I just want to say this. Before you leave, I want you to promise that we'll have you back here soon.
1,000%. And I appreciate your kind words very much.
God bless you. We're out.